Well, thank you very much. And with that, we'll go on to talking about another RFP. So the financial expert request for proposal. So, Bob, don't leave yet. We're going to ask you to leave. but
this is another information item that
quite.
provides a status on an RFP for the audit committee financial expert. Again, I'd like to receive some input from the committee on this RFP as well. And the ARM committee charter includes a provision for the committee to retain a consultant to advise the committee on their oversight role for financial matters, including financial reporting. Dr. Robert Yetman has served in this capacity as a consultant to the committee since 2007, and his current contract expires in June of 2016. Now, this is a consultant for the board. However, Audit Services administers this contract and on behalf of the committee, and so we're getting ready to issue an RFP shortly so that we can finalize this contract in the near term. And I'd like the committee's input on a couple of concepts here with regards to this RFP as well.
So, what I'd like to do is see if board members have some questions of Bob about the work and his perception of it. But then I think when we start to have a conversation about what we're looking for, we might ask Bob to excuse himself. So that's why I pulled him back in. I don't know if, especially looking at the list of the scope of work, if anybody has any questions that they'd like to ask Bob before we have our discussion. I just wanted to provide that opportunity. So I see, and Larry, are you ready for us to start asking questions? Because I've got a couple of people in the queue.
Sure.
Okay, great. So Betty.
Thank you, Paul. So I don't know that it was clear in the background, but what was the actual term of this contract? Or was it?
Yeah, and so it doesn't say at this point. He's been serving in that capacity for 2007. I believe this is another one that is a longer term period for some consistency with the board, and as board members rotate it provides that consistency. And so I would personally recommend like another 10-year period. Again, with the board has an annual consultant evaluation process, but we would have an opt-out clause included in there as well.
Actually, I probably am the one with the history of this. I've been here longest when this got set up. It was actually a bit shorter, but the board chose to continue the contract. It's a relatively modest consulting fee, so the board chose to exercise their powers to renew it. It was really. I think we all recognize it was finally time to refresh it through a formal bid process, and that's really why it's before you today. You clearly always have the powers to sole source this kind of proposal for a continuation, but again, best practices would suggest you do a formal public bid.
And then I guess with respect to the work and responsibilities, I would like to incorporate what we just talked about with respect to consultation about how we set up this audit performance review process. Okay, you can add that. Thank you.
Lorena?
Yeah, so feeling still a little new to some of the relationships between committees, consultants, the board. Something that you said in the previous item to Dr. Yetman about the independence versus a partnership, that strikes me as something that I think of differently with our relationship to the expert. And so I wonder if you could say, I think of that as more the opposite, that we are looking for a partnership in our relationship. So I want to make sure I'm thinking about that correctly.
Thank you for the question. So this position works for you. It is a partnership with the ARM committee and to some extent with the entire committee. The independence needs to be between this position and staff. I work with staff. I like working with staff, but they're not my friends. It's a professional distance that needs to be kept and maintained. However, between the board and this position, no, that is a close partnership and a sharing of ideas in frank and honest format. But there does, I believe, need to be an independence. In this position, that's not true for all consultants, right? It's just this is the auditing consultant. That consultant, I believe, needs to be strictly separate from staff. But again, I would caution and say that's not necessarily the case with all consultants. But this is the audit.
Thank you.
Seeing no more questions for Bob, maybe you could take a little walk for a minute. Is there any thoughts that anybody has about? Oh, Jack.
Just one, I wanted to take you back just to the origination of the contract, just to calibrate your expectations a bit. When we first came up with the board for this concept, and I had used this concept when I was when I chaired the board in Colorado at Para. We had the retired CFO of course, actually, as the expert for our audit committee, and I thought that worked extremely well, helping the formal board members of the committee. So we talked about that and liked the idea of it, but then finding someone in the market that would provide this unique, just like a retired CFO example, it was hard. As it turned out, I taught Bob's class on corporate governance one night and talked more about what his background was and thought, well, this might be a interesting opportunity. And then we found another professor at Sac State, also in finance, that had interest in providing similar services. And those were our two bidders at the time. And so I just want to, again, calibrate expectations. As I said, I kind of assumed we didn't want to dip into a multinational accounting firm to pull out an expert, that you were looking for a little more customized personal service around what you've had. So we'll do an RFP. I have no idea what we'll get back. I don't know. We went and actually got two people that were interested before in doing this. And the board and the committee did the selection entirely. Again, going back to process as last time.
During the prior item when we talked about our external auditor, both Chris and Larry and others made comments about the challenge of bringing in a new auditor because they take some time to ramp up, know the organization, and then really start to deliver, deliver value. Would you say the same is true of this consultant?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
I think the biggest hurdle is, I'm not sure I feel as strong as you, Larry, on that point, but I think the biggest hurdle, frankly, we're in open session, but I'll say it anyway. Frankly, there's just a lot of consultants that don't do a very good job and get paid well for doing mediocre work. It's fine. It's hard to find people that deliver exactly what you want here. I think that's you're going to have a quality hurdle more than anything. I would be more focused on that more than anything here. If you'd like to continue this same type of robust discussion you've had in the past.
And I guess the comment that I would just make is in the time that I've been on the board, I have found Bob's support for the committee and interaction with the committee extremely valuable in terms of playing what I feel is an independent role, as well as helping us ask the questions that we may not have the expertise to ask. So I am.
Well, you've benefited from a very authentic conversation in this committee, and speaking honestly from my side, this organization had a lot to improve on. We've had this last 10 years of all the things we've done on the finance side. I mean, we've gone from 0 to 100. So we needed nudging as well as making those changes, and I think that's part of what makes the stress, constructive stress, in making us a better organization, because we certainly had a lot we had to work on.
Well, I might be inclined to just say, well, let's just extend his contract, but I don't think that's the way we should be doing it. It's not the way he wants us to do it. He's pretty insistent that we should be going through some kind of an RFP process. I fully expect he'll bid. I think he likes the work. But I think we should be going through that process. I guess the question is, does anybody, other than, Betty mentioned connecting the scope of work to that oversight of the auditor, that more explicit process that Larry's going to ensure we're doing, and so that would, I think, would be a good responsibility. I think the one thing that I see that still is a little unclear just in terms of where the responsibility is, but to the extent that IT cyber risk is something that this committee looks at, and it still seems to sometimes come back to this committee, even though I'm not sure that this is what our charter is. I don't think the board anywhere has a similar independent consultant on that. Bob is not that person. He knows he's not that person. I don't know that we should be adding that as a responsibility, but it's still an area that I have concern about just in general in terms of the. I mean, the only kind of help we get is Graham, who reports to the board on the implementation of the new system, but that's not cyber risk. That's a different thing. So, at some point we might want to think about that, but I don't think that should be put on top of this financial expert. So with that aside, I guess I would think we're fine here. I don't see any sense that we're not. We need to move pretty quickly because the contract ends at the end of this fiscal year. So our thought would be, as a proposal for how we go about this, that we would move quickly to disseminate the RFP, and we would have an interview of the full committee of any finalists at our June meeting, so that we can make a selection. So that's 4 months from now. And I would also propose that a subcommittee to help get us there, identify the finalists, would be myself as chair and the treasurer as vice chair, so that we have a 2-person subcommittee. If that is okay, I don't think we can be any larger than 2 because we're a committee of 5.
The caveat that I had in here was like if we have more than 3 candidates, that we would do these preliminary interviews. Okay.
Right. So we'll have a committee that will be basically Larry and the treasurer, his designee, and myself, that will go forward to bring then candidates to be interviewed at our June meeting. Okay. Excellent. Okay.
That provided us direction. This RFP is well underway and will be out shortly, just pending this committee's input. So thank you for that direction.
Okay, and so our next, so if somebody maybe can find, Bob, and tell, thank you. So item 7, the fiscal year 2015-16 audit plan. Larry.
Yeah, I'm pleased to report that we're on track with the audit plan. And as of February 1st here, Audit Services actually has now completed 27 employer audits, and another 19 are in progress, and 6 of those are already in draft. And so we're making good progress towards completing our audit plan. What we're seeing in those school district audits, our common audit findings include unreported post-retirement earnings, errors in reporting to our DB versus our DBS plans for items such as one-time payments, and then incorrectly reported sick leave or excess sick leave. There's kind of the new items that we're seeing throughout these. And I previously reported to the committee a process whereby we notify the benefit services area when we identify those school districts that have systemic reporting issues. And I'm happy to report that process seems to be working well. Specifically, our program analysis and training team for the member account services area has been out to the school districts now that we've identified and started providing training. I outlined those in the agenda item for you. We of these 24 audits, 7 of them actually had no findings, and so that's good news as well. But as a result of the others, we have about $1.2 million that we identified in reporting errors that resulted in revenues that were due to CalSTRS. And we also see a decrease in the number of appeals. Even though we've increased the number of audits, we see a decrease in the number of appeals that are occurring, which I think speaks to the quality of the work that our staff are doing, and I really appreciate that. And we, on the internal side, we have 3 internal audits that were completed and 8 that are in progress for this year. And I'll just pause if you have any questions with regards to those that are included in the summary of the agenda here on those audits.
Betty?
Just had a question about the private equity audit.
Okay, we're gonna.
Oh, are you gonna go through that? Before?
Yeah, actually,
Okay.
let's just do that right
Okay,
now.
let's do
I think that's great, unless there's any other pressing questions.
Well, I mean, I think, yeah, there are other parts of the report I'd like to come back to, so, but let's go to the private equity. I think that's where the bulk of our interest probably is.
Perfect. We had, I'd like to invite them to come forward as well. We had Macias, Ginny, and O'Connell complete a private equity investment review, and this audit is included as attachment 3. It's on ARM, page 54. And I'll just turn the time now over to Richard Green from MGO, and he can introduce the team and present the results of that audit to the committee.
Thank you, Larry. I'd like to thank the committee for the opportunity to present the results of our work. To the left of me is Debbie Chan, a director in our practice, and was one of the lead management people on the engagement. And Leah Ju, to her left, a manager who was on the engagement as well. I'm sorry. So the objective of our work was to determine if a selected group of general partners participating in a private equity portfolio were adhering to CalSTRS limited partnership agreements, side letters, and guidelines for some very specific and significant functions within the private equity activity. And there's 4 of them. They relate to capital calls and distributions, management and incentive fees, investment valuation, as well as reporting requirements. And we also wanted to take a look at whether or not CalSTRS operations and procedures in these 4 areas, whether or not they operated within their procedures and processes as well through that period of July 1st, 2013 through June 30th, 2014. The work that we performed are considered consulting services, even though we're working with internal audit services, and those standards are promulgated by the AICPA. I want to speak a little bit about the approach to our audit. What we did is we worked with internal audits and investments to identify 4 partnerships. Cortec, and there are 3 funds there. KKR, 2 funds. Welsh, Carson, Anderson, and Stowe, 6 funds. And the Palladium Equity Partners, 2 funds. So these are the general partners in which we then went out to their locations. So we performed the work in 2 locations, on-site at the general partners, as well as we came back to CalSTRS. So when we were on site with these general partners, the general approach that we took is we look at some underlying documents that supported the either capital calls, capital distributions, management incentive fees, or investment valuation and reporting. And we took this information to some very basic supporting documentation. We took it back to the general ledger or to a bank statement or to audited financial statements. But more importantly, what we did is we subjected these amounts to the limited partnership agreement and, again, side letters or guidelines to determine adherence to those documents. And then we came back to CalSTRS and we performed similar procedures. So out at the limited partner or the general partners arena, what we typically will look at the calculations. Are these calculations done correctly in adherence with these documents? Is the proper approval process at the general partner level occurring? And again, is this all supported with just some basic underlying documents such as a general ledger, audited financial statements, and then bank statements as well. I am pleased to present to you that in general, the general partners were adhering to the limited partnership agreements, side letters, and guidelines. And CalSTRS was also in adherence with their internal processes and procedures as it relates to those 4 critical functions within the private equity activity. However, with that said, we do have 2 observations, okay? In one observation, we consider to be we consider high risk, and the risk definitions are contained in our letter in the attachment, and they were also prescribed in. We worked with internal audits to design these in terms of the risk assessment. So we had one high risk assessment that I'm going to ask Debbie Chan to talk about, and then also we had a medium risk observation as well as a byproduct of our work. So Debbie.
Okay. As we just mentioned, so we had 2 observations resulting from our audit. The first one's relating to the 4 critical areas: capital costs, distributions, management fees, and carry interest. The focus of our observation is there's no independent verifications of those amounts paid or received by CalSTRS. The 2 important points to mention pertaining to this observation. First is that the current established process and procedures associated with these areas are operating as designed, and that we did not identify any discrepancies in the recalculations of the amounts for the selected transactions. So that's 2 critical points to bring out. However, to strengthen the current process and procedures, we recommend that an independent verifications of capital costs, distribution, management fees, and carry interest to ensure that the amounts are calculated in accordance with the LPA or the limited partnership agreements, as well as CalSTRS investment percentage ownership.
Okay, so let's pause. I want to make sure we're clear here. So we had no deviations or findings with respect to a lack of adherence to the limited partnership agreement, side letters, or guidelines. So that's not the issue. The issue is there's no independent verification of these amounts embedded in CalSTRS internal processes and procedures. So if there was an error, the current process right now perhaps wouldn't identify those errors because there's not an independent check of these amounts that is proactively done on CalSTRS sides. That is the recommendation that we're making, that those independent verifications do occur.
Thanks, sir. The second observation relates to the GPs or the general partners' timeliness in submitting audited financial statements to CalSTRS. We noted 2 out of the 13 funds tested. The GP, the general partners, submitted the audited financial statements 120 days after their year end, as opposed to the 90 days that was required or prescribed in the LPA, the limited partnership agreement. And that there was no documentation to explain the reason for the late submissions. We also noticed for the 2 funds in questions that CalSTRS used the partners' unaudited financial statement to report the March 31st net assets values, and that those values were not compared to the audited financial statements, which were subsequently submitted by the partners. Again, to enhance or to strengthen the current procedures and process, we recommend that management strengthen the current process by ensuring that the partners submit timely audited financial statements, and that for instances of late submission, there should be some sort of documentation as to the circumstances surrounding that late submissions. More importantly, for the funds that CalSTRS used unaudited financial statement to report the net assets values, those values should be compared back to the partner's audited financial information or financial statements upon receipt from those general partners. So for these two observations, management concur with our recommendations in the process of developing action steps to address the recommendations.
Those are the two observations that we've had to strengthen the internal processes and procedures on CalSTR's side, and be happy to answer any questions that you have regarding the work that we've performed.
Betty, you still have the floor.
I guess just a question for clarification. So what does independent verification look like? I mean, is this staff, and I appreciate management's response and concurring with the finding.
You refer to the first
Yeah.
finding, ma'am?
Yeah, the first finding with
Yeah,
respect to
what that means is what we want to do is to encourage that when information comes to CalSTRS, and it could be through a capital call, which also may have embedded with management fees, capital distribution, which in some instances will have some realized incentive fee calculations, any of those items that CalSTRS goes through and does an independent verification of these amounts, on their side, given their understanding of the LPA guidelines or side letter. So they effectively would do, in large part, what we have done as part of this assignment. So instead of just assuming that the information is correct, they go through and do the recalculations over. Okay, that's all we're saying.
To make sure that it's consistent with the LPA and
Yeah.
that the amounts allocated to CalSTR is based on, CalSTR's
Ownership
investment
percentages.
ownership percentage.
Yeah.
And I think, I guess from the staff perspective, this is going to be a resource-intensive effort. So,
Money.
right?
Almost everything, in addition to what you're currently doing, is going to be a resource constrained, or at least it has to be a decision that's made whether or not it's how you approach it. And it's not necessarily, and it looks like Mr. Edelman will have some commentary here in a moment. We're not recommending what degree this verification occurs, whether it's on a sample basis or 100%. Certainly I wouldn't do 100%, but regardless, it will take additional effort. There is no doubt.
So management agrees with their findings. I think, I appreciate they reviewed 47. They did not find any problems. And I can tell you from our experience at other funds I've been at that have audited, you generally don't find much because the partnership is audited. But I realize we're only a small slice of the partnership. So we can't hire staff. We can't house the staff to do this internally. So we'll look at external firms to pick up. And I think that'll be the key is how much we want to spend on it. Probably do a sampling and just do a constant double check. Our hope is that with the new template in private equity, we can actually get the partnerships to audit themselves so that we don't have to pay for it alone. But we'll figure it out, and we'll look at external services. It's all going to this and the cost reporting in the investment committee. It's all kind of building up to some kind of a better, more robust system so that we don't have to throw people at a problem, but we can do something more electronic. But we're not at that point yet.
To do this, because, I mean,
Internal staff, we're not comfortable that we can gear up enough internal staff to be able to do this ourselves. We think it's going to be better suited to hire an outside firm to have them work on it. We're going to even look at, because this issue is popping up at other LPs, can we team up with an Oregon or a Washington? Are there some ways to do something cost effective? We'll figure it out.
Yeah, and I do want to comment on that. This is not unique to CalSTRS. We serve a variety of large public employee retirement systems. Everyone is grappling with this issue. So,
Larry?
Yeah, thank
And
you.
I got a number of
There
board
is
members
a
who
control in place that is listed in the report here that we didn't discuss. Is there is a degree of reliance on the external partners' financial statements and them being audited. Our accounting area reviews those, our investment area as well, and I think that that's important. But there's also good, better, and best. And as we're demanding more transparency from these partnerships. I think the measures that we're taking here really, we're saying, hey, we want some additional transparency, and we're going to validate that. And so I think that that's a good message for us to move forward with and implementing these recommendations.
I think that, Rick is saying 100% is not necessary. Chris, the staff response wasn't to do 100%, it was to do a sample. Seems to me the question is sort of what's the right amount of sampling to do that's cost effective and reasonable. I want to hear from others on the committee, but I would think that, and if you don't mind, Chris, I did have a conversation with Robin and Bob about this ahead of time, but the thinking that basically your staff and Robin and Larry might get together and figure out what the right thing to do is that responds to the audit concerns, responds to your business practices, and rather than the committee telling people, trying to make a decision about the approach that it would be done in that way.
Yeah.
But that I don't want to foreclose the conversation. I've still got several other people in line who have questions or comments. So, Christina.
So I would agree with what you just said, and Chris, you answered my first substantive question. I just had a note on ARM 61. The target completion date, December 31st, 2015. Does that mean December 31st, 2016? Or have you already put these for observation number 2?
Yeah, as Deb was just helping me in the background, we've already implemented some of these. We in PERS have hired a law firm to starting doing some audits, which were underway. Part of that was, part of the cost reporting. We're trying to figure out how big to make all of those contracts, and we'll use the proper sampling method that any audit firm would use. The private equity portfolio is very large with probably, 140 partnerships, but is a real concentration of really just people we're re-upping with and where the exposure is, and we'll make a good sampling of it.
In the sampling will inevitably be based on risk. And I'm sure that's, you look at size in relation, the general partners in size in relation to the overall portfolio. And what do you know about these general partners that may lead you down to a path that, hey, we have a higher degree of risk of potential error here. And so it's, quantitative and qualitative kind of elements within the risk process, the risk assessment process.
So I'm not a member of this committee, but I'm just hanging out because I love audits
We
so
welcome
much.
you.
I love
We're
audits.
thrilled to have you.
But as the chair of the investment committee, I think, this conversation was relevant to me, and Paul and I have talked about this a bit. And back to Betty's comment, I was wondering, it's come up a couple times about this independent review and making sure, your analogy, Larry, of kind of good, better, and best. I mean, we want to be the best. We want to provide the most amount of transparency and disclosure just because we think that's best practices. And so my understanding, too, is this independent review, it's probably best practices to have somebody sort of from the outside, if you will, right, providing that second pair of eyes instead of internally, just partly because of that, right? Is that the thinking? That the independent, is there a best practice with that in terms of the independent review, or you can both
I'll take it
opine?
Independent, I think what they're suggesting here is independent from the partnership, right? Because the partnership is really, And so how we implement that with regards to, internal or, other resources, I think that's what's important, is that it's independently validated from the partnership.
That was the intent of the comment, the context.
And I appreciate his comments with regards to risk, because, a carried interest in performance management fees calculations are very different than, say, a capital call or a distribution.
Absolutely.
So we can work with implementation and how we structure that.
Yes.
You guys coordinating together and figuring out what you think is best, and then reporting back to audit seems like a intelligent solution.
I have one question. So when you did this audit, you went in, you looked at the books of the general partner or documentations from the general partner. So in a case, for example, such as the calculation of carried interest. How deep did you go back in determining the basis on which the carried interest
That's an
calculation was
excellent
made?
point, and I was just thinking, how far do I go with this discussion? Because it can happen, it can open up a lot of questions, and I think it would be appropriate to have that discussion. You see, we didn't go back as far as you absolutely could. Where we went to is to a general ledger, a set of audited financial statements, perhaps a bank statement, depend upon the number that you're looking at. So, if you think about it, we didn't go back into the actual individual transactions at the general partner level that made up, for example, a number that you would see on their audited financial statements. Let's just say a change in the accrued incentive fee, okay? So we just went back so far. So if you really want to get comfortable with the underlying calculation, let's say for an incentive fee, an accrual, or even a realized one, you'll have to go much further back and actually look at the underlying transactions that make up the basis for those calculations. Let's say for a total fund gain, or whatever it happens that you're looking at. So we only went back so far, and that's a point that we brought up in our exit conference with Larry Jensen and Chris Ailman, that there were certain limitations, or what else can we do to even enhance the work that we've done? Now, we've done what is traditionally done. So what we've done is very typical in the industry, but you can go back further if that's the decision that's made.
And that's possible to do. We could get the cooperation of general partners.
Well, I don't.
What would it involve?
I will have to say, and this is just my opinion, you'll probably get pushback from the general partners. To my knowledge, you don't see this occurring very often, if at all. But like I said, I'd have to defer to Mr. Ailman and what he's experienced. I know on the audit side, what we did is we went back to the documents that you would typically, in a traditional environment, when you're operating on these type of items in the private equity portfolio, you go to, because you do place a certain level of reliance on the audited financial statements. Are there unmodified opinions? Is there any indication of internal control weaknesses? And in the absence of these type of items, you have to make certain assumptions that the information that you're starting with is in fact accurate.
Chris?
We don't think it's worthwhile for us to go to that extent because, again, we're less than 10% of the partnership and we're benefiting the whole partnership. We're basically auditing their auditors. We'd like to go through the partners and ask them periodically to subject themselves to a review of their audit. It'd be like a group of members hiring an audit firm to come in and review what Crow did. We'd be like, wait a minute, I'd rather have a group, all the partners do it. Yeah. And then the other thing is the SEC is in part doing that for us. By them coming through, it's why we're totally behind their review and encouraging them to come in and look at the partnerships, because they're able to go back and do this double check for us, which is another level of comfort and added security or certainty to their financial statements. But the key is to look at their financials, make sure they're audited, they have a clean opinion, which we're doing in all of our partnerships, holding them accountable. And then hopefully I think we can push the industry to push the limited partners to demand more reviews of the audits, so that we make sure these are very clean and done proper, so that there's a reconciliation between the limited partnership agreement and the financial statements.
Yeah, and I guess that's my question: is the auditors, their audit, the outside auditor for the general partner, they're delivering an audit with respect to whether the financials are reported consistent with generally accepted accounting principles, not necessarily that they're in compliance with the general partnership agreement. Is that right? And what our concern though is the general partnership agreement. So who is making sure that the general partnership agreement is being complied with?
I'd just like to, one thought on that is, you know, where this is, the accrual of this and the basis that you're suggesting going back and maybe looking at is a tremendous workload and probably a tremendous cost. And
I'm not trying to suggest we do it, I'm just trying to identify
what's
whether
really,
we've got a disconnect here where the general, where the audited financial statements of the general partnership are not telling us what we need to know as to whether or not the general partnership agreement is being complied with. That's my question.
Right.
The second question would be if there's a disconnect, then we need to think about how important is that disconnect and what can we do about that disconnect. But
I think that's in part of your question is what they're recommending we do or hire somebody out to do is to double check our capital calls, our fees against the ILPA. Right. And we are currently doing this with CalPERS. They picked 5, we picked 5 through a law firm. Right. Because it's almost less of an audit function, more of a lawyer function to look at an agreement and make sure the accounting is flowing through and following the agreement.
That's my question.
And that's what we're doing on a spot check basis, and I think we'll continue to do it, frankly, in all the asset classes. But I would, again,
That's important.
rather than us doing it alone, I'd like to see the partnerships paying for that so that we're not footing the bill for everybody else.
Completely agree. But
So
I
it's
would just as long as we're
Bob
we're-
just
as long
whispered
as
in
we're
my
clear
ear,
that
cost-benefit
right,
analysis.
That we're not that just as we're clear that relying on an audited financial statement of the general partner is not sufficient, and that's why we're doing this other work.
Yeah, and the audited financial statement is on the partnership.
Right.
Not just because I want to make sure for some of the new board members, many of these general partners are public companies and they're audited, but our partnership is what we get a statement that's audited.
Right. Okay. Yeah, Margot, did you have something to add?
I don't have much to add except that this has been on our radar screen many, many years, and we've talked to many, many auditors saying, what reliance can we put in your audited financial statement? And we get a pretty wide range of responses, but one thing in common is not total. So we do rely on things like the SEC. We do have these types of audits that MGO completed, so we rely on spot checks.
Wonderful. Any other questions or concluding remarks? Otherwise, I know we're still on this agenda item where there's a lot of other pieces. If there's anything, Larry, that you want to particularly highlight, because we've got a lot of...
no, that concludes this agenda item, and unless anybody has any specific questions.
You know, the only question I have is having looked at some of the reports on the progress we're making on addressing some of the deficiencies seen with internal audit, from the internal audits that we've done, that, you know, some of them seem to be addressed pretty quickly. Others seem to hang on for a while. I wonder whether Larry, your shop could be creating some kind of an expectation as to when these things should be addressed, and comment on. I mean, what we're seeing is we're seeing a commentary about how much progress has been made, but not necessarily whether the progress that's been made is really taking the thing seriously. Because if it's still hanging around after, you know, a year or two, when it's, you know, looks like it's pretty simple to resolve, or it's a serious problem that needs to be resolved quickly, I don't think we're getting that sense. And as I read through a number of them, I was saying, why hasn't more progress been made?
Yeah, I appreciate that comment. You know, that's specifically the reason why I try to separate those out between those that are less than 1 year and over 1 year, because, you know, in my opinion, management is more or less accepting the risk associated with not implementing those recommendations. And so when we perform our follow-up, we look at, you know, one is the kind of the cost benefit of it, and two is, you know, what progress has been made, and if they're not making progress, then I would highlight that to the committee. But I think another thing that we try to do is integrate this with the enterprise risk management program, where if they're essentially accepting those risks, that they understand that, and we want to include this as part of the executive discussion about progress being made on implementing these and whether the risk is at an acceptable level or not. And
Well,
so,
and I guess the question is whether you could, when you deliver a report and you get a response from staff, whether there could be an agreed upon date by which it would be resolved, so that we know going in. We see that with a lot of other things that come to this committee, but we don't see it with the internal audit. Any other questions then on that item? If not, thank you very much for your work on that. That was really excellent and very helpful. Back to Larry, the Chief Auditor update.
let's see, item 7B, which is our
Oh, I'm
proposed
sorry,
plan
I'm
updates.
sorry. We're on.
Briefly.
Yes, I'm sorry. We're on 7B, proposed plan update. I'm sorry.
That's okay. The charter requires that I inform the committee of any changes to the plan, and we did have a real minor change here. And I've outlined it for you. We had to reallocate some hours with regards to excess leave by, or unanticipated leave by some staff. And really what happened here was the direct reporting regulations that were expected to be implemented during this year were delayed until April, and as a result, we were able to just use those hours and reallocate it in the plan. So we're on track. On the chief auditor's...
Any questions on that before we go? No. Okay.
On the Chief Auditor's report, I just want to inform the committee that on Wednesday, January 27th, the Association of California School Administrators held a 2016 Superintendent's Symposium where the board chair, Harry Kiley, and also Christine Brasinio, the Director of Retirement Service, and I presented training on CalSTRS audits and the role that they play statewide, and we discussed kind of our methodology for selecting schools and how the audit impacts them, how they can prepare for an audit, as well as our 6 most common audit findings, continuing to promote training and education. And feedback is that it was real successful, and we enjoyed doing that, the opportunity there. An update real quick on our external quality assurance review. That contract has been awarded to KPMG. We're finalizing that now. They'll start that work in the March-April timeframe. We'll bring back the results of that to the committee at the June meeting. Speaking of the June meeting, we have a couple of items of interest on there. I think that we'll bring our audit services charter for review for the committee, as well as the work plan, our annual education items, with regards to GASB 72 and progress on our ethics and compliance program, as well as an update on our audit plan and in our QAR that I mentioned. So with that, I'm happy to answer any questions.
So I think you skipped right over to item 10 then, which is a review of the agenda. And the only question I would have is as it's drafted right now, it doesn't talk about GASB 72. It does talk about the ethics and compliance program. Are we going to have time to cover both?
I'll work with Brian and Robin on that, and,
Okay.
and then I'll get back to you.
Well, let's look at that so that we make sure we can do them both justice. Any comments on the agenda? Otherwise, I'll go back to item 9. Bob?
I normally don't comment on an agenda, Mr. Chair, but just back to the item you said, which is the ethics compliance review educational session, and you asked if there might be enough time to do both, the GASB 72 or this. And as much as I love GASB and GASB 72, I think it's adorable. However, in my opinion, I would hate to see the ethics and compliance program education fall off in favor of an accounting pronouncement, especially when that pronouncement doesn't take effect for some time in the future. So I think it's good for the board to keep an eye on that, but I would hate to see this, an item that appears important to me, to be displaced. Thank you.
Well, that's I think the consideration. It could be that we put 72 onto our next agenda. Although that's what? September, yeah, okay, so as long as it's not in the November. Robin has some thoughts
So
on that.
I just wanted to clarify, it is effective for our financial statements in 15-16. Obviously, the financial statements won't be released until November. So it's just a matter of your interest in understanding prior to the release of those financials, or how much prior, because we could do it in September as well.
So we have a June meeting and a September
September
meeting.
meeting. So,
Seems to me we
just-
should put one in one and one in the other. And then we can do them both justice. And I don't think there's any other educational topics that are, so let's do that, and we can decide which goes first, but let's separate them. Okay. Okay, back to information requests?
There were no information
None?
requests.
Okay. Opportunity for statements from the public? Okay, seeing none. Then we're adjourned. Thank you very much.